What happens when one of Hollywood's most beloved actors spots an elderly man sleeping on a park bench during a freezing night and decides to stop his car? What began as a simple act of compassion turned into an extraordinary encounter that would change multiple lives forever. And by the time the sun rose over the city, both men would discover connections so profound and unexpected that it would leave them, and everyone who witnessed it, in tears. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. The late February night was unusually cold for Los Angeles. A rare winter storm had swept through earlier in the day, leaving the normally warm city caught in a bitter chill that sent most residents retreating indoors. Streets that would typically buzz with nightlife even on weeknights were virtually deserted as temperatures dipped into the low 40s, practically Arctic by Southern California standards. It was just after 3 a.m. when Keanu Reeves was driving home from the set of his latest film. Production had run late, complications with a difficult stunt sequence requiring multiple retakes long into the night. Exhausted but still alert, Keanu navigated his black Porsche through the empty streets, the quiet solitude a welcome contrast to the controlled chaos of the film set. As he passed through Westwood, taking a shortcut through a residential area near UCLA, something caught his eye in the small neighborhood park to his right, a splash of color against the darkness. He slowed the car, peering through the passenger window. There, illuminated by a single street lamp, was an elderly man lying on a park bench. A thin blanket that might have once been blue covered his lower body, while a worn backpack served as a makeshift pillow. Even from the street, Keanu could see the man's breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Without hesitation, Keanu pulled to the curb and switched off his engine. A homeless person sleeping outdoors wasn't an uncommon sight in parts of LA. But something about this particular scene, the vulnerability of the elderly man, the dangerous cold, the utter solitude, struck him deeply. He sat for a moment, considering his options. He could call a shelter, though at this hour, most would be full. He could contact emergency services, but would they prioritize a non-medical situation? Or he could simply check on the man himself, perhaps offer assistance directly. Keanu chose the third option. Grabbing his own leather jacket from the back seat, he quietly exited his car and approached the park bench. As he drew closer, he could make out more details. The man appeared to be in his late 70s or early 80s, with a full beard that had long since turned white. His face was weathered, mapped with deep lines that told of decades under the sun. Despite the cold and his circumstances, there was a certain dignity in the way he had arranged his few possessions neatly beside the bench. "Excuse me, sir," Keanu said softly, not wanting to startle the man. The older man's eyes opened immediately, alert, clear, and startlingly blue. Not the eyes of someone who had been deeply asleep, nor the disoriented gaze one might expect from someone living on the streets. He looked directly at Keanu with surprising clarity. "I'm sorry to wake you," Keanu continued, "but it's extremely cold tonight. Can I help you get somewhere warmer? Perhaps a shelter or—" "I appreciate your concern, young man," the older man interrupted, his voice carrying a slight accent that Keanu couldn't immediately place. "But I'm perfectly fine here." Keanu looked skeptical. "Sir, it's below 40 degrees. That's dangerous, especially—" He hesitated, not wanting to reference the man's age directly. "Especially for an old-timer like me?" The man finished with a small smile, slowly sitting up on the bench. "I've endured much worse, believe me." There was something in his manner, a quiet confidence, an articulate speech pattern, that didn't align with Keanu's experience of people living on the streets. This man didn't appear to be suffering from the mental health or substance issues that so often accompanied homelessness. He seemed lucid, intelligent, and oddly at peace despite his circumstances. "At least take this," Keanu said, offering his jacket. "It's going to get colder before dawn." The man looked at the jacket, then up at Keanu's face, studying him with intensity. "You're that actor, aren't you? From those action movies?" Keanu nodded, used to being recognized but still slightly uncomfortable with it. "Yes, sir. My name is Keanu." "Sit down, Keanu." The man patted the bench beside him. "If you're determined to help an old man at 3 in the morning, the least I can do is offer you a conversation in return." Something about the invitation felt genuine, almost compelling. Despite the unusual circumstances, a Hollywood star and an apparent homeless man sharing a park bench in the middle of the night, Keanu found himself sitting down. "I'm Martin," the older man said, finally accepting the offered jacket and draping it over his shoulders. "Dr. Martin Chen, though it's been many years since anyone called me doctor." "You were a physician?" Keanu asked. Martin nodded, gazing across the dark park. "Neurosurgeon, for nearly 40 years." The revelation surprised Keanu. This man sleeping on a bench had once been a neurosurgeon. The disconnect between Martin's former profession and current circumstances raised countless questions, but Keanu didn't want to pry invasively. "That's a challenging field," he said instead. "It was my life's purpose," Martin replied simply. "From the moment I held a scalpel, I knew I had found my calling. The human brain. There's no greater mystery, no more complex landscape to navigate." His eyes took on a distant look, as if seeing operating rooms from years past. "May I ask?" Keanu began carefully. "How a neurosurgeon ends up sleeping on a park bench?" Martin finished, a wry smile crossing his face. "It's not the tragedy you might imagine. I'm not here out of financial ruin or some dramatic downfall. I have a perfectly comfortable home about 20 miles from here." Keanu's confusion must have been evident, for Martin continued, "Tonight is the anniversary of something important. Every year on this date, I come to this particular bench. It's a ritual, you might say, a remembrance. In the freezing cold. The physical discomfort is part of it," Martin said cryptically. "It helps me remember." The conversation might have continued along those lines, with Martin gradually revealing more about his unusual annual vigil, had it not been for what happened next. A sudden gust of wind that swept across the park, catching the thin blanket at Martin's feet and sending it tumbling across the grass. "I'll get it," Keanu said, standing quickly and jogging after the escaping blanket. He caught it just before it reached the street, noticing as he did that a small piece of paper had been dislodged from the folds of the fabric and was now skittering across the sidewalk. He retrieved both items and returned to the bench. "I think this fell out," he said, extending what appeared to be a worn, folded note. Martin's expression changed instantly. His composed demeanor gave way to visible alarm as he reached for the paper with urgency. "Thank you," he said, his voice tighter than before. "That's very important to me." As Martin took the note, it unfolded slightly in the transfer, and Keanu caught a glimpse of what appeared to be a child's handwriting and a small, faded drawing. Martin noticed his glance and hesitated, holding the note carefully between weathered fingers. For a long moment, he seemed to be making a decision. Then, with deliberate movements, he fully unfolded the paper and held it under the glow of the street lamp. "This is why I'm here tonight," he said quietly. The note was written in blue crayon, the handwriting unmistakably that of a young child. It read, "Dear Dr. Chen, thank you for fixing Mommy's brain. You are a superhero without a cape. I drew you with angel wings because Daddy says you were sent from heaven. Love, Emily Stewart, age 7. Below the text was a simple drawing of a smiling man in a white coat with angel wings sprouting from his back. "Emily Stewart," Martin said, his voice taking on a distant quality. "Daughter of Catherine Stewart, one of my patients from 1988. Catherine had a cerebral aneurysm that was deemed inoperable by 3 other surgeons. She was 32 years old, a single mother raising a brilliant little girl." He traced the edge of the paper delicately. "I performed a 16-hour surgery that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible at the time." "You saved her," Keanu said softly. I did, Martin acknowledged. Catherine lived another 15 years before cancer took her. Long enough to see her daughter graduate high school, long enough to know Emily had been accepted to medical school herself. His eyes grew moist. Emily became a pediatric neurosurgeon. She saved dozens of children over her career. Keanu looked at the cherished note, then back at Martin, sensing there was more to the story, something that still didn't explain the annual night on a cold bench. "But that's not why you're here tonight," he said gently. Martin's gaze shifted to meet Keanu's directly. "No," he admitted. "I'm here because of what I failed to do." He refolded the note carefully, returning it to his pocket. "You see, for every Emily Stewart, for every life I managed to save, there were others I couldn't help, and one in particular that has haunted me for 35 years. He gestured to the park around them. On February 26, 1989, exactly 35 years ago tonight, a young woman named Maria Reeves brought her 8-year-old son to the hospital where I worked. She had been experiencing severe headaches, confusion, occasional loss of balance, classic symptoms of a growing brain tumor. At the mention of the name Reeves, Keanu went completely still. "The scans confirmed our worst fears," Martin continued, unaware of Keanu's sudden change in demeanor. "An aggressive glioblastoma, already at stage 4. We operated immediately, but..." His voice broke slightly. "It was too extensive, too entangled with critical brain structures. We couldn't remove enough of it to make a difference. She died 3 weeks later." Martin looked down at his hands. "That little boy sat in the waiting room all night during the surgery. When I had to tell him and his grandmother that I couldn't save his mother, he didn't cry. He just looked at me with these incredible, soulful eyes and asked if his mum was still in pain. When I said no, he thanked me for trying to help her." He shook his head slowly. "The grace of that child broke my heart. I've carried that moment with me every day since." Keanu was barely breathing now, his mind racing through memories from over 3 decades ago. "Every year on this date, I sleep on this bench. The same bench where I sat after my shift that night, questioning everything I knew about medicine, about my own abilities, about the unfairness of a world where a young mother could be taken from her child," Martin explained. "I come here to remember my failures along with my successes, to remain humble, to never forget the responsibility we bear when we hold others' lives in our hands." "Martin," Keanu said, his voice barely audible, "what hospital did you work at in 1989? "Toronto General," Martin replied, looking slightly surprised by the question. "I was division chief of neurosurgery there from 1984 to 1996 before relocating to California." Keanu's hands began to tremble slightly. "And the boy, Maria's son, do you remember his name?" Something in Keanu's tone made Martin look more closely at him, really seeing him perhaps for the first time that night. Recognition began to dawn in his eyes. Not recognition of a famous actor, but of something far more profound. "His name was Keanu," Martin whispered, his face draining of color. "My God, it's you." For a moment, neither man spoke. The only sound was the distant hum of a city that never fully sleeps, and the rustling of leaves in the cold night breeze. "I remember you," Keanu finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "I remember sitting in that waiting room with my grandmother. I remember your blue surgical cap. You had kind eyes, even when you were telling us she was gone." Martin's hands were shaking now. "All these years, I never knew what happened to you. I looked for updates occasionally over the first few years, but patient confidentiality..." He stopped abruptly. "I've followed your career since your first films, but I never made the connection. The last name, yes, but you were just a child then, and it's been so long. My grandmother took me back to Hawaii after the funeral," Keanu explained. "We stayed there for 2 years before moving to Los Angeles. By then, I had taken my stepfather's last name for a while, before switching back to Reeves later." "And now here you are," Martin said in wonder. "Of all the people who could have driven past this park tonight." Keanu smiled softly. My mother would have called it fate. Mine would have called it providence, Martin agreed. Another silence fell between them, but it was different now, filled with the weight of their shared history and the extraordinary coincidence that had reunited them. You know, Keanu said after a while, I've never blamed you for not being able to save her. Even at 8, I understood that you did everything possible. Children often understand more than we give them credit for, Martin replied. But knowing you don't blame me and forgiving myself are two different things. Is that why you've slept on this bench for 35 years? As some form of penance? Martin considered the question. Perhaps initially. Over time it evolved into something more like a meditation, a way to reconnect with my purpose, to remember why I became a doctor in the first place. To help people, yes, but also to witness both their suffering and their courage. Your mother showed tremendous courage. She did, Keanu agreed, and so did you, taking on cases others considered hopeless. How many lives did you save that way? How many Emilys are out there because you were willing to try when others weren't? Martin shook his head. You sound like my wife. She used to say something similar. Used to. She passed 10 years ago, Martin said. Alzheimer's. The great irony, a neurosurgeon helpless against his own wife's brain disease. Keanu felt a renewed wave of sympathy for this man who had carried so much, both professionally and personally. Did you continue practicing after you moved to California? He asked. Until I was 72, Martin confirmed. The last 15 years were devoted primarily to teaching and research. I helped develop several surgical techniques that have become standard practice for certain types of tumors. He looked at Keanu with sudden intensity, including a method that has improved survival rates for the very type of glioblastoma your mother had. Too late for her, but not for thousands of others since. Keanu was silent for a moment, absorbing this information. So in a way, my mother's case helped you save other mothers. Yes, Martin said simply. Her loss meant something. It changed me, changed my approach to seemingly impossible cases. I became more innovative, more willing to challenge conventional wisdom. The night had grown even colder, but neither man seemed to notice. They were connected now by an invisible thread that spanned decades, linked by the memory of a young mother whose life had touched them both in profound ways. Martin, Keanu said finally, I can't let you spend the rest of the night on this bench. Not at your age, not in this cold. Please let me take you somewhere warm. Your home, a hotel, my place, anywhere but here. The older man looked like he might protest, but then he glanced at the note in his pocket and something in his expression shifted. Perhaps the ritual has served its purpose, he said quietly. Perhaps this meeting is a sign that it's time for a different kind of remembrance. Keanu stood, offering his hand to help Martin up from the bench. The older man accepted, rising somewhat stiffly after hours on the hard surface. I have a guest house, Keanu said. You're welcome to stay as long as you'd like. My chef makes an incredible breakfast. He paused. And I'd like to hear more about your work, about the lives you've saved, about the advances you helped create, maybe even about my mother, if you remember anything else about her case. Martin nodded, gathering his few belongings. I remember everything about Catherine Stewart and Maria Reeves, he said. Some patients stay with you forever, the ones you save and the ones you lose. I'd be honored to share those memories with you. Together, they walked slowly toward Keanu's car, the world-famous actor and the retired neurosurgeon, connected by loss and found through an extraordinary coincidence that felt like something more than chance. As Martin settled into the passenger seat, he carefully removed the folded note from his pocket once more, looking at it thoughtfully before handing it to Keanu. Emily Stewart sent me a card every year on the anniversary of her mother's surgery, he explained. This was the first one, the one that meant the most. I think your mother would want you to have it. A reminder that even when medicine fails, the attempt matters. The care matters. The love behind it all matters most of all. Keanu accepted the precious note with reverence, touched beyond words by the gesture. As he started the car and pulled away from the curb, he glanced at Martin. "You know, I have connections at several medical foundations," he said. "If you'd be interested, I could arrange for you to speak with researchers working on cutting-edge treatments for brain tumors. Your experience could be invaluable." "I'd like that," Martin said, his eyes brightening. "Very much." What began that night with a chance encounter between two strangers on a cold park bench evolved into something neither man could have anticipated. Over the following months, Keanu helped establish the Maria Reeves Memorial Fellowship at Toronto General Hospital, funding promising neurosurgeons specializing in previously inoperable brain tumors. Martin Chen served as the program's advisor, mentoring a new generation of doctors with the wisdom of his decades of experience. The park bench where they met was eventually replaced with a new one bearing a simple plaque for Maria and Catherine, and all the mothers whose courage inspires us to never stop trying. Every attempt to help another matters. And every February 26th, instead of spending the night alone in the cold, Martin joined Keanu for a quiet dinner, where they raised a glass to the woman who had unknowingly connected their lives across decades, a young mother whose loss had created ripples of healing that would continue long after both men were gone. Sometimes the most profound connections are formed through our deepest wounds. Sometimes the note in a stranger's pocket can change everything. And sometimes a simple act of compassion, stopping your car for someone in need, can heal wounds you didn't even know you carried. As for Dr. Martin Chen and Keanu Reeves, their chance encounter reminded them both of a truth too often forgotten in our busy world, that we are all connected in ways we may never fully understand, and that even our most painful losses can, in time, become the source of our greatest contributions to others. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe for more extraordinary true stories that remind us of the power of compassion and connection. Share in the comments if you've ever experienced a chance encounter that turned out to be something more. Remember, sometimes the most meaningful moments in our lives come disguised as ordinary coincidences.